This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. The series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to take a look at Red's best 2-drop creatures. A couple of years ago, I looked at 1-drops in every color, so it's about time we also take a look at the 2-drops. One of Red's greatest strengths is, of course, its small creatures, so it should come as no surprise that Red has some of the best 2-drop creatures in the game. Obviously, enough to be eligible for the list, a card had to be a red creature that costs 2 mana. In all, there were 381 cards eligible for this list, and in this video, we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest mark on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Grand Prix. Alright, let's dive into the list. At number 10, it is Earthshaker Kenra. This is a good one to start with because it's fairly representative of what we'll be seeing on the list. Creatures with good stats that can do a lot of damage in a hurry. The Kenra is a 2-mana 2/1 with haste, and when it enters the battlefield, a creature with power less than or equal to the Kenra's can't block that turn. It also comes with Eternalize, which means you can pay 6 mana when it's in your graveyard to get a 4/4 token copy of it in play. Obviously, this means it can make even bigger things unable to block. It's great on turn 2, and great that it gives you something impactful to do with your mana if the game goes long. In Amonkhet Standard, Mono Red aggro was the most dominant deck, and the Kenra was a big part of that. It has also gained a single point in Pioneer Mono Red, but it doesn't have any points since 2020, so there's a good chance it loses its spot on this list in the near future. At number 9, it is Emberth Shieldbreaker. This is a vanilla 2-mana 2/1, but it also comes with a really nice adventure, Battle Display, a 1-mana sorcery that lets you destroy an artifact. If the Shieldbreaker's in your hand, you can cast it as its adventure, then it gets exiled and you can cast it as the Shieldbreaker from exile. You can of course also simply cast this as a 2-mana 2/1 and skip the adventure, but you get a 2-for-1 if you have a target for Battle Display. It saw a ton of play in Standard, even as a main deck card, as the format featured many powerful artifacts, including Embercleave and the Great Henge. It's also seen sporadic play in Modern, primarily as a sideboard card in Death's Shadow. It hasn't gained any points since 2021 though, and like Earthshaker Kenra, its spot on this list is in danger. At number 8, it is Smouldering Egg. The egg isn't exactly aggressive. After all, it starts out as a 2-mana 0/4 with Defender. In addition to aggro being a central part of Red's identity though, so too is an interest in instants and sorceries. And with this card, every time you cast an instant or sorcery, the egg gains Ember counters equal to the mana value of that spell, and once it gets to 7 or more, it turns into Ashmouth Dragon, a 4/4 flyer that does 2 damage to any target when you cast an instant or sorcery. Obviously, that's a pretty amazing deal for only 2 mana, even if it does take some time to transform. Unsurprisingly, the egg has been played in spell-heavy decks in Standard, most typically control decks, where you can play this out early as a blocker, and then just destroy and counter stuff until it becomes your win condition. It hasn't gained any points outside of Standard yet, but it does have more time to accumulate points in the format before it rotates. At number 7, it is Viashino Pyromancer. This one is pretty simple. It's a 2-mana 2/1 that does 2 damage to a player or planeswalker when it enters the battlefield. That may not seem all that impressive at first, but you're actually getting a really efficient deal. It feels pretty good to pay 2 mana for a guaranteed 2 damage that can even sometimes pick off a planeswalker, while also adding a 2/1 to the board that can threaten to do even more damage by attacking. The Viashino was a fixture in Red aggro decks when it was in Standard, and it's continued in that role in Pioneer. At number 6, it is Magda, Brazen, Outlaw. She's a 2-mana 2/1 that gives all other dwarves +1/+0, and when a dwarf becomes tapped, including herself, you get a treasure token. She also comes with the ability to sacrifice 5 treasure to get an artifact or dragon directly out of your deck onto the battlefield. She's doing a whole lot for only 2 mana, including providing some serious ramp. She saw a ton of play in Standard, including in fairly traditional red aggro decks, but she really excelled in decks that also had a treasure sub-theme, so they could get extra value out of her. She was particularly spicy alongside Goldspan Dragon, because her treasure became more potent and she could search it up and put it into play if you had enough treasure. She hasn't gained any points since rotating out of Standard, but I don't think it is completely out of the question that she finds some success in Pioneer or Historic in the future. At number 5, it is Goblin Engineer. It's a 2-mana 1/2 that lets you search up an artifact and put it in your graveyard. You can also pay 1 red and sacrifice an artifact to reanimate an artifact with a mana value of 3 or less. As we've already seen, most of the creatures on this list are great at attacking and help you lower your opponent's life to 0. But not Goblin Engineer. Its value comes from its powerful artifact-loving abilities. The Engineer is for Modern Horizons, and that means it was never legal in formats like Standard or Pioneer, but it's made the most of its legality in Modern and the Eternal formats, seeing play primarily as a way to search up cheap artifacts that are part of powerful combos. In Modern, it's been used to set up the Thopter Foundry Sword of the Meek combo, since it's able to search up both halves. When you have both of these cards in play, you can pay 1 mana with the Foundry and sacrifice a non-token artifact to make a 1/1 Thopter. If Sword of the Meek is in your graveyard, as it will be if you sacrificed it, it will return to the battlefield and attach itself to the new 1/1 token. So, for every 1 mana you have, you can make a Thopter every turn, which quickly overwhelms your opponent. The great thing about that combo in particular is you really only need to get the Foundry in play, so you can even sacrifice a Sword of the Meek in play to get back a Foundry you put in your graveyard with the Engineer. More recently, it's been played alongside Tameshi Reality Sculptor in a deck that specializes in constantly bringing back Lotus Bloom. With Tameshi's ability to make a bunch of mana, the Engineer is great for getting that bloom into your graveyard. In Legacy, it's largely been used to set up the Painter's Servant Grindstone combo. With Painter in play, all cards are all colors, so 1 Grindstone activation mills your opponent's entire library. It's also the centerpiece in a recent deck to emerge in Vintage called Is It Artifacts, which features a slew of powerful artifacts the Engineer can tutor up, including the Time Vault Voltaic Key combo, which allows you to take infinite turns. So, yeah, the Engineer is very well positioned to keep being played in the formats it's legal in, as it's one of the most powerful ways to set up artifact-based combos. At number 4, it is Kari Zev's Skyship Raider. She's a 2-mana 1/3 with First Strike and Menace, and she generates a 2/1 Ragavan token when she attacks. Now, the Ragavan token she makes isn't quite as powerful as the more recent Ragavan that has dominated multiple formats, but either way, she represents a ton of damage that is challenging to block. The combination of First Strike and Menace can be particularly nice in the early game, because if your opponent wants to double block her, they need to make sure their creatures will still do enough damage to take her down after she does First Strike damage. In other words, blocking her with X1s is pretty much out of the question. She saw a lot of play in standard mono-red aggro decks and has continued in that role in Pioneer, where she's likely to keep gaining points. At number 3, it is Dreadhorde Arcanist. The Arcanist powerfully combines Red's love of attacking with its love of instants and sorceries. It's a 2-mana 1/3 with Trample, and when it attacks, you can cast an instant or sorcery for free from your graveyard with a mana value less than or equal to the Arcanist's power. Free spells are great, and the Arcanist's ability to generate impressive value out of the graveyard has led to it being played in every single format it's legal in. In Standard, it was utilized in red-white feather decks, which were already interested in playing lots of cheap combat tricks, which were both great to copy from the graveyard and great for enhancing the Arcanist's power, so it could cast even more powerful spells. In Historic, it's been played in decks like Rakdos Midrange, which feature a slew of cheap and powerful spells, like Unholy Heat and Thoughtseize. However, it's gained the bulk of its points in the Eternal formats, where there are a huge number of cheap spells for the Arcanist to feast on. In Legacy, it's played in the spell-heavy Delver deck, and it proved to be so good in that format that it actually got banned there in February of 2021. Vintage is a format loaded up with cheap spells, and the Arcanist has also thrived there, particularly in Jeskai spells decks. The Arcanist is going to continue to compile points in multiple formats, and I think it has an outside shot at eventually being the number 1 card on the list. For now, though, there are 2 cards in front of it. Like our number 2 card, Eidolon of the Great Revel. This 2-mana 2/2 is all about pushing damage. Anytime a player casts a spell with a mana value of 3 or less, it does 2 damage to them. While that effect does hurt both players, the decks that run the Eidolon are hyper-aggressive decks like Burn and Red Deck Wins. They don't really care about losing life, because their whole plan is to win the game before their opponent can ever stabilize in the first place, and the Eidolon does make it pretty hard for that to happen. If they are playing blockers or removing your creatures so they can survive, they're still going to take damage because of the Eidolon. It tends to chip in a whole bunch of damage for a very low mana investment, and that's exactly what those kinds of decks want. In Standard and Pioneer, it's mostly been played in mono-red aggro decks, typically known as red deck wins, and in Legacy and Modern it's gained points in Burn. It's likely to gain more points in Pioneer and especially Modern going forward, and it isn't that far behind the number 1 card on the list, which is Young Pyromancer, a 2-mana, 2/1 that spits out a 1/1 elemental token every time you cast an instant or sorcery. That's pretty great and adds some serious value to cheap spells that already tend to be pretty efficient and powerful. The Pyromancer is considered by some the best 2-drop in the game, and at the very least, it's in the conversation. Over the years, it's been played in decks in every format. Especially, obviously, in decks that play a lot of instants and sorceries, because it allows you to play a control game. You can counter spells and lightning bolt your opponent's creatures, while still adding to your board with those elemental tokens, who can eventually just run your opponent over. It's going to keep gaining points in multiple formats. It will be interesting to see which of the top 3 on this list win out in the end, as they are all impressive multi-format all-stars. So those are the 10 best red 2-drops in Magic. If you want to own any of these efficient and powerful creatures, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card featured in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly, and if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.